The brutal dictator of Iraq from 1979 to 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime hides often overlooked stories of what he did to American soldiers during key conflicts, including the Gulf War and the Iraq War. Saddam Hussein's regime not only used American soldiers as human shields, but also subjected them to brutal treatment, including the torture of POWs during the Gulf War, and orchestrated deadly insurgent tactics in the Iraq War, leaving a lasting legacy of fear and violence. To understand the actions taken against American soldiers, it is essential to get into Saddam's rise to power and the origins of his antagonism towards the West. Born on April 28, 1937 in the impoverished village of Al-Awja near Tikrit, Iraq, Saddam grew up amid poverty and political turmoil that shaped his worldview. He was raised in a tribal environment where loyalty and power dynamics were deeply ingrained. His exposure to Arab nationalist ideas, emphasizing unity and resistance to foreign influence, ignited his political ambitions. In 1957, Saddam joined the Ba'ath Party, which promoted Arab socialism and unification of Arab nations under a single ideology. Saddam's aggressive rise began with his participation in a 1959 plot to assassinate Iraq's then leader, General Abdul Karim Qasim. The failed attempt forced Saddam to flee, eventually seeking refuge in Egypt, where he pursued studies in law while continuing to network with other exiled Baathists. These years in exile were pivotal, allowing Saddam to refine his political acumen and cement alliances within the party. Returning to Iraq in the mid-1960s, Saddam capitalized on the instability within the country. He emerged as a key figure in the 1968 Ba'athist coup that overthrew the previous regime and placed Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr in power. Behind the scenes, Saddam wielded significant influence, systematically eliminating rivals and consolidating his control over the Ba'ath Party's security apparatus. By 1979, Saddam had maneuvered himself into the presidency, a position he secured by ruthlessly purging perceived enemies, including senior party members, in a calculated display of dominance. Once in power, Saddam launched an aggressive militarization program, channeling Iraq's oil wealth into building one of the region's largest and most formidable armies. His vision extended beyond Iraq's borders, as he sought to position the country as the leader of the Arab world and a bulwark against both Western and Iranian influences. Saddam framed his policies as defense of Arab sovereignty, portraying the West, particularly the United States, as a destabilizing force that sought to exploit the region's resources. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 intensified Saddam's hostility towards the U.S. Initially, the United States provided indirect support to Iraq, hoping to counterbalance the influence of post-revolutionary Iran. However, Saddam viewed this relationship as opportunistic, fueling his perception of American duplicity. This mistrust deepened as the war dragged on, with Saddam increasingly convinced that Western powers prioritized their interests over the stability and sovereignty of the Middle East. This animosity set the stage for Saddam's confrontational approach, defining Iraq's fraught interactions with American forces in the years that followed. In August 1990, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait set off a chain of events that culminated in one of the most significant military conflicts of the late 20th century. By occupying Kuwait, Saddam aimed to assert Iraq's dominance over the Gulf region, a move met with unanimous international disapproval. The United Nations imposed economic sanctions, and the United States, leading a coalition of 35 nations, initiated Operation Desert Shield, which transitioned into the military campaign known as Operation Desert Storm on January 17, 1991. This campaign began with an extensive aerial bombardment, followed by a decisive ground offensive that liberated Kuwait within 42 days, officially ending on February 28, 1991. While the military victory was swift, the human cost for captured U.S. soldiers was enduring and harrowing. During the Gulf War, Iraqi forces captured approximately 21 American soldiers, subjecting them to horrific conditions that flagrantly violated international law. These prisoners endured grueling physical abuse, subjected to severe beatings with implements such as rubber hoses, wooden planks, and batons, tools that were used methodically to inflict pain, suffering, and submission. The use of rubber hoses as weapons was particularly widespread among Iraqi forces. These flexible, yet unforgiving implements could be wielded with significant force, causing deep bruising and internal injuries. They were often used to target the most vulnerable areas of the body, with minimal medical attention offered to the injured. Wooden planks were another favorite instrument of torture, delivering bone-breaking blows and severe lacerations with repeated strikes. Their use was both indiscriminate and relentless, as captives would often find themselves at the mercy of their captors without any means of self-defense or escape. Also, batons, heavy, solid tools capable of inflicting sustained trauma, were used in brutal sessions of physical punishment that left captives battered, bloodied, and in unbearable pain. Reports indicate that prisoners were subjected to continuous interrogations with beatings designed to extract confessions or to instill a sense of helplessness and despair. This systemic and calculated abuse was meant to convey to the captives that there was no hope of rescue, no reprieve, and no escape from the violence and degradation inflicted by their captors. Mock executions were staged to instill psychological terror, often leaving deep mental scars. Iraqi state television further exploited these captives for propaganda, broadcasting their bruised and battered images to undermine U.S. morale and project a facade of Iraqi dominance. Such actions constituted a blatant disregard for the Geneva Conventions, which expressly prohibited the inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. Among the most notable accounts of captivity was that of Major Rhonda Cornum, an Army flight surgeon captured after her Black Hawk helicopter was shot down during a rescue mission. Severely injured with broken arms, a gunshot wound, and other trauma. Cornum also endured sexual assault and psychological abuse during her captivity. Despite these ordeals, her resilience became emblematic of the courage and determination shown by American POWs. Similarly, Army Specialist Troy Dunlap endured relentless beatings and psychological manipulation, illustrating the extreme cruelty inflicted by Saddam's forces. The treatment of these prisoners was part of a broader strategy of Saddam's regime to project defiance against coalition forces. By 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime was in a state of turmoil, facing its most significant military challenge with the onset of a full-scale invasion by the United States and its allies. This invasion was predicated on the search of weapons of mass destruction and a belief that Iraq posed a security threat to the United States and its allies. The war commenced with the Shock and Awe bombing campaign, a large-scale airstrike designed to cripple Iraq's military and infrastructure. This initial strategy aimed to decimate Saddam's military capacity and force his government into submission without the need for prolonged ground operations. Despite this strategy, the war escalated quickly into ground combat as coalition forces pushed into Iraq, with unpredictable results. During these early stages of the war, the capture and treatment of American soldiers and contractors became a central and troubling aspect of Saddam's regime's actions. The violence directed towards these individuals signaled the deep desperation and brutality of Saddam's loyalists. Private First Class Jessica Lynch's case stands out as one of the most well-documented examples. On March 23, 2003, Lynch's convoy was ambushed near Nasiriyah, a location in southern Iraq that proved devastating, leading to the deaths of several of her unit members. Jessica Lynch, just 19 years old, suffered catastrophic injuries in the attack, including severe fractures to her spine and legs. Following the ambush, she was captured by Iraqi forces and taken to a local hospital. She was held in captivity for 9 days without access to adequate medical care or hope for a swift recovery. Her captors reportedly limited her treatment, and accounts indicate that the hospital where she was confined offered the bare minimum to sustain her. On April 1, 2003, U.S. Special Forces launched a daring and high-profile operation to rescue her. The mission involved coordinated efforts by elite military units to infiltrate the hospital in Nasiriyah, where Lynch was being held, and extract her from captivity. The operation itself was highly strategic. U.S. troops reportedly relied on intelligence from a variety of sources, including accounts from local informants, to locate Lynch and execute the mission. The raid on the hospital was executed with precision, with Special Forces soldiers storming the facility and retrieving Lynch without incident. The successful extraction took place with minimal resistance from Iraqi forces, and Jessica Lynch was returned to a U.S.-controlled area, bringing relief to her family and the American public. During the course of her captivity, accounts later revealed that an Iraqi lawyer had played a pivotal role in ensuring Lynch's safety. The lawyer reportedly provided critical information about her location, which allowed American troops to target the rescue operation effectively. The rescue itself was met with mixed reactions. Early media reports characterized Lynch as a symbol of heroism, noting that she had continued to fight even after suffering severe wounds and losing her comrades in combat. However, subsequent investigations revealed discrepancies in these initial reports. Reports later indicated that the extent of her injuries, including evidence of being tortured and her physical condition, were likely influenced by her captivity rather than the combat zone. This discrepancy further complicated the narrative surrounding her story. Journalists, military officials, and even her own family members later provided conflicting accounts of Lynch's injuries and circumstances. Some sources indicated that she had been shot during the fighting or while in captivity, while others disputed this account, arguing that her wounds were more consistent with mistreatment or a lack of adequate medical care. Following her successful rescue, Jessica Lynch was transported to a military hospital in Ramstein, Germany, where she received further medical attention and began the process of recovery. Another significant case of capture and survival included Thomas Hamel, a civilian contractor working for Kellogg Brown & Root, a defense contractor with ties to the American military. On April 9, 2004, Hamel was abducted during a risky convoy operation in Iraq after his convoy was ambushed on the outskirts of Baghdad. The convoy Hamel was a part of was part of KBR's logistical operations, a defense contractor with close ties to the U.S. military. The convoy consisted of civilian trucks and military support vehicles, tasked with transporting supplies to maintain operational readiness in various military installations. However, on April 9th, the convoy was caught off guard during a sudden and violent ambush by insurgents. The attack took place about 5 miles from Baghdad's international airport, as the group moved through hostile territory. The attack escalated quickly, with insurgents utilizing various methods of assault, including heavy firepower and RPGs. In the chaos, Hamel's truck was struck. His driver attempted to escape, but while his colleague managed to evade, Hamel was captured by insurgents. During his 24 days as a prisoner, he faced severe deprivation. Limited access to food and water made his survival uncertain. Throughout his time in captivity, Hamel was moved between several locations. His captors sought to conceal his whereabouts and minimize the risk of U.S. troops finding him. Hamel's escape came after a combination of determination and opportunity. During his captivity, he found himself in a location relatively close to U.S. forces. And while his captors moved him frequently, his sharp sense of timing and observation allowed him to wait for the right conditions. The moment presented itself when a U.S. military convoy came into range. That was when Hamel managed to signal to the passing military personnel by desperate gestures. He made his way in a tense barefoot run across rocky plains, leading to a successful rescue and freedom. Between 2003 and 2006, American military personnel and contractors faced a grim reality. Reports estimate that more than 200 U.S. soldiers and contractors were captured or went missing during the conflict in Iraq. The methods of abuse and torture employed during this period were particularly shocking, highlighting the disregard for international conventions and human dignity by Saddam's regime and its loyalist insurgents. Captives were being subjected to a variety of cruel methods, including waterboarding, electric shock, systematic beatings, and deprivation of basic needs, such as food and clean drinking water. These tactics were employed not only to extract intelligence, but also to instill terror among coalition soldiers and to demoralize American military personnel. The captives' suffering during these years illustrated the brutal nature of asymmetric warfare, where soldiers and contractors often faced enemies willing to use extreme measures to weaken their resolve. The techniques of torture employed were horrifying, and the psychological toll on the captives was immense. These actions were not merely isolated incidents, but a calculated strategy used by insurgents and loyalists to shift the momentum of the war by creating fear and uncertainty among American troops. The escalation of abuse during the Iraq War reflected more than just isolated instances of violence. They symbolized the broader desperation of a regime that was cornered by military advances and political pressure from the United States and its allies. With the regime's military capabilities crumbling and the nation spiraling into chaos, these forms of inhumane treatment became part of a strategy intended to undermine the cohesion of the coalition's efforts. Saddam's regime demonstrated a calculated and systematic approach to psychological warfare as part of its military strategy, using propaganda to undermine the resolve of American soldiers and coalition forces while shaping international public opinion. One of the key methods involved the use of state-controlled media, particularly Iraqi television broadcasts, to capture and humiliate American soldiers. During the 1991 Gulf War, footage of captured U.S. soldiers was deliberately aired, showing them bruised, injured, and visibly fatigued. These broadcasts violated the Geneva Conventions, which prohibited the public dissemination of images of captured prisoners under duress. Despite these legal breaches, Saddam's regime used these broadcasts to undermine the morale of U.S. soldiers and their allies, while projecting a sense of Iraqi strength and defiance. These tactics were aimed at eroding confidence among American troops and sending a powerful psychological message to the international community. The intention was not simply to demoralize, but also to send a clear signal of resistance to U.S.-led military operations. By showcasing these images of suffering and captivity, the regime sought to instill fear and reduce the will to fight among coalition forces. Such acts of psychological warfare were not limited to the Gulf War, but were revisited during the 2003 Iraq War, where similar techniques were employed to achieve similar objectives. During the 2003 conflict, captured soldiers were also paraded on television and forced to make public statements under duress. These statements were carefully staged to align with Iraq's propaganda, often portraying U.S. military actions as oppressive and unjust. This was another calculated move designed to influence public opinion, sow division among coalition forces, and weaken the resolve of both soldiers and civilians. These broadcasts drew swift condemnation from the international community, emphasizing Saddam's blatant disregard for established international norms and human rights. Beyond televised broadcasts, Saddam's regime utilized printed propaganda, such as leaflets, to spread its narrative. These leaflets targeted both Iraqi civilians and soldiers, depicting American troops as aggressors intent on destroying Iraqi sovereignty. Some propaganda leaflets spread alarming and false claims, including assertions that captured U.S. soldiers were executed. Psychological manipulation extended to threats targeting the families of captured soldiers. These strategies extended beyond military campaigns to broader diplomatic and psychological operations, emphasizing how the regime viewed war as a contest not merely of arms, but of perception, fear, and narrative control. Saddam's efforts to project strength and resistance through psychological manipulation had a lasting impact, influencing U.S. public opinion, the confidence of soldiers, and international perceptions of the conflict in the Middle East. Saddam Hussein's reign came to a definitive end on December 30, 2006, when he was executed after being found guilty of crimes against humanity for atrocities committed during his rule. However, the impact of his regime's brutal actions remained deeply etched into the lives of countless individuals. Over 4,500 American soldiers were killed in Iraq during the conflicts stemming from his policies, and tens of thousands more suffered life-altering injuries. While Saddam Hussein's regime has been consigned to the pages of history, the legacy of suffering is a reminder of the human cost of tyranny and war.